plot. So I think it stands to reason that both the villain and the love interest are underdeveloped, which wouldn't bother me so much if the movie had anything resembling a spine. And while we're on the subject of dumbass kids, may I just ask, whose idea was it to put an F Mary kill joke in a supposed Spider-Man movie? As if there wasn't enough mean-spirited bullshit in this f***ing movie. I also really dislike Ned Leeds. He's loud, rude, narcissistic, unfunny, unsympathetic, and unnecessary to whatever plot this movie is going for. I'm honestly not sure why Peter Parker even wastes time being friends with him. He's an even bigger liability for Spider-Man than this Spider-Man is to the Avengers Initiative. If someone I was friends with ever did that to me, I'd stop wasting my time talking to them. And I know what some of you are saying in the comments. They should have gone with Harry Osborn. Dear Sony and or Disney Marvel, on the off chance that you happen to be watching this and you're thinking about bringing Harry Osborn into the MCU, allow me to let you in on a little secret. Nobody gives a f*** about Harry Osborn. You had 2 chances to make Harry Osborn a believable character, and to quote Angry Joe, you done f***ed it up. Flash Thompson in The Amazing Spider-Man was a better Harry Osborn and Eddie Brock than the 2 Harry Osborns we got. Outside of Spectacular Spider-Man, I never once bought that Peter and Harry were friends. Sony and or Disney Marvel, if you have any sense whatsoever, leave Harry Osborn and his dipshit father out of the MCU. The Goblin
is dead. Bury it.
Circling back to the subject of surprise motherfucker moments, this movie, believe it or not, actually has a second one, and I'm kind of so-so about it because, well, it's pointless. So there's a character in the movie named Michelle Jones. Her superpower is just happening to be wherever Peter and his big mouth dickhead friend are based on what the scene needs. Michelle's first scene in the movie is during lunchtime when the dumbass duo are so hypnotized by Liz, I feel like I'm in a damn Michael Bay music video. And Michelle has to point out how juvenile it is for these 2 domos to be staring at a valedictorian like she's naked. This scene and the pool scene are mostly where I get off calling Liz Allen jailbait. Because Ned Leeds is too to keep a secret and he lets it slip that Peter knows Spider-Man, Liz invites Peter and Ned and seemingly the entire student body to a party at her parents' house where Flash Thompson just happens to be DJing, who, by the way, could easily be Mati from Captain Planet with what little this motherfucker has going for him. Man, did I get sick and tired of hearing this kid run his mouth about Peter Parker's Michelle, because she's the ninja of the movie, randomly chastises Peter and Ned for showing up at this quote-unquote lame party. First of all, this is not a party. This is a poor man's attempt at a raid. One of these things is not like the other. And second of all, what the f*** does it matter that they're here? Is there a crime against them being here? Ned, in the only shred of competence he displays, rightfully points out that she's at this party too. She responds very ominously with, "Am I?" What in the hell kind of a question is that? Peter tracks Vulture to Washington, D.C. under the pretense of showing up for the high school academic decathlon nationals, even though he just dropped out of it, and Michelle randomly shows up to get on the bus, hoping to, quote, do some light protesting at the National Monument. Wait, protesting to f***ing what? The next time we see Michelle is when she's outside the monument after an alien power cell ruptures and blows up while Ned, Raja, and Liz are on the elevator. And by the way, the fact that I was actively wishing that Ned would die in that explosion should tell you exactly how I feel about this slow-witted, unfunny dipshit. Cisco Ramon is 10 times funnier and 10 times smarter than this f***ing Ewok. When Peter gets detention for being AWOL, he and Michelle are conveniently the only 2 people who are in detention, even though she apparently didn't do anything to get herself in trouble. Then, the next time we see her is when Peter takes Liz, to the titular homecoming dance, and Michelle responds to Peter by flipping him off. I'm sorry. Did this kid do something to piss you off, or are you just trolling him? After Liz goes away, Michelle is inexplicably promoted to captain of the athletic decathlon team, and Michelle, very nonchalantly I might add, says, "My friends call me MJ." Does that nickname remind you of anyone? I'll give you a hint, it's not Michael Jordan. Yeah, apparently Michelle is supposed to stand in for the girl next door herself, Mary Jane Watson. Wait a minute, her friends call her MJ? What friends? Now let me just say this. A lot of people seem to be annoyed by this change to Mary Jane Watson. I don't really care about that so much because, first of all, outside of Spectacular Spider-Man, we haven't really had a definitive enough take on Mary Jane for this to be a problem, as far as I can tell. And second of all, as I mentioned earlier, Michelle is kind of in and out of the movie. She's not really a major character yet. My issue with it is that this girl spends the majority of the film magicking her way into the plot whenever the movie remembers that her character is a thing, and conveniently, she manages to be in scenes with Peter. Michelle's friends call her MJ. That sounds like a very specific habit for Michelle to just now bring up. Of course, if you look closely at the Breakfast Club parallels, Michelle is basically the Allison Reynolds analog, except she's stalking another teenager, despite claims behind the scenes and apparently in universe that she's not obsessed with Peter and is just claims that I would probably take with a grain of salt since this is Sony we're dealing with. You'd think that after the detention scene, Peter would be like, excuse me, are you following me? And speaking of observant, let's finally talk a little bit about Spider-Man himself and why I have a hard time caring about him as a character. The first thing my sister asked me when we walked out of the theater was, do I think Tom Holland is a better Spider-Man than Andrew Garfield or Tobey Maguire? But before I can answer that, we need to talk about whether or not this version of Peter Parker has earned the right to call himself Spider-Man. Unfortunately, my definitive take on Spider-Man lives in the void between animated series Spider-Man, Spectacular Spider-Man, and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. And while I liked Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man the first time around, his character didn't really have much to work with. One of the things I always liked about Spider-Man as a character, and why I liked Andrew Garfield over Tobey Maguire, is that he helps people because he has the power to prevent dangerous things from happening. Yes, Garfield's Spider-Man starts from a guilt-driven revenge place after his uncle is murdered. Not only is it his fault that he's dead, but it's also his fault that he's in that situation. But he eventually learns the power and responsibility lesson and develops that moral code naturally, rather than being on the nose about it, like in the Raimi films. When Peter inadvertently causes the lizard incident, he tries to prevent it from getting worse, both because it's his responsibility that it happened, and because he decides that helping people is more important than revenge, doing what the police can't. While Spider-Man 2 might have had a better story, Amazing Spider-Man most certainly had a better Spider-Man. First of all, Peter Parker was more of a scientist in that movie, and second of all, he had more of a sense of humor, both in and out of the Spider-Man costume. And most importantly, his girlfriend wasn't an angsty ditz, a one-dimensional jailbait bozo, or a stalker, or a block of wood. I'm sorry, but Shailene Woodley is a terrible casting choice for Mary Jane. Luckily, she never made the final cut. By the second movie, though I'm not saying that's a better movie, Peter is more about helping people and giving people hope, and seems to genuinely love fighting crime, doing good things because they're good things. This Spider-Man doesn't have those sorts of avenues, mostly because Peter Parker's priorities don't seem to be in the right place, and partly because, as Lankara points out in his review of One More Day, Marvel seems to be unwilling to let Peter Parker become an adult and make his own decisions. Uncle Ben Parker is neither in the film, nor is he even mentioned, beyond a token scene where Peter begs his dipshit friend Ned not to say anything to Aunt May because of, quote, everything that she's been through. But that could mean anything. Maybe she just got out of a hospital after getting into a car accident. Maybe she was in a hostage situation, or maybe her long-lost brother was killed. It's possible Peter might be talking about Ben Parker, but again, it's vague. I'm not even sure if this kid even has an uncle. I don't need to see a retelling of the origin or a rehash of the power and responsibility message. I do, however, think acknowledging Uncle Ben's death just once would have gone a long way to legitimizing this version of Spider-Man in the MCU, if Uncle Ben's death is even the reason this Peter became Spider-Man in the first place. But more than that, this Peter Parker doesn't seem to have any agency in his actions beyond Tony Stark. You can't use the excuse of he's a teenager. I'll let you in on a secret. I was a teenager too. But here's the thing. Being a teenager isn't, nor has it ever been, a good enough excuse for ignorance, recklessness, or stupidity. Did we really need to give Peter Parker an annoying best friend? Did we really need to take Peter Parker back to high school? Does anyone really give two flying fuckity fucks about Peter Parker's high school years? And while we're at it, this is a fair question, but what the happened to Peter's spider sense? He clearly had it in Civil War. Why doesn't he have it here? Peter's motivation throughout this movie is just generically about the thrill of being an Avenger, or trying to impress Iron Man. So we have Tony Stark standing in for Uncle Ben, and the movie trying desperately to make him a father figure for Peter, and I don't buy one single solitary thing about it. As I mentioned earlier, Tony Stark has been making stupid-ass decisions ever since the Ultron incident. He is both figuratively and literally the last person this little motherfucker should be looking to as a mentor. But then that seems to be the big problem. Peter Parker isn't really a character in this movie. He doesn't have any real hobbies, nor does he have any personality. He's a walking, talking avatar of the novelty of having Spider-Man back in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but with the essence of Spider-Man doing good things because they're good things completely removed. And never mind having the burden of responsibility, as Super Mike points out in his review of it. As a character, Peter doesn't carry any indication that he likes helping people because it sets a positive example, or even because it's a good thing. He doesn't seem to like helping innocent people for the sake of itself, and we never get any sense that he feels any obligation to it. The few people he does manage to save are just people he knows. The deli manager in Queens, that busted-ass Mike Wazowski wannabe motherfucker, the Eric Cartman wannabe motherfucker, the jailbait valedictorian, the dirty crook father of the jailbait valedictorian, and half of them aren't even really innocent. I'm not even sure if this Peter Parker has a moral code like Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, but that's not the only thing he's missing. He also doesn't seem to have any sense of self-preservation either. We've already mentioned Tony's idiocy, but when Peter gets back to his home and climbs into his room, he takes his mask off and he drops down from the ceiling only to find Ned Leeds sitting on his bed. From that point, anything and everything that could go wrong for this Spider-Man does. My issues regarding the Spider-Man tech suit are more the fault of Captain America Civil War before they're the fault of this movie. The moving eyelids on the mask are a decent touch, as that's an homage to the 60s series, but the rest of the costume looks too rubbery, mostly because Spider-Man doesn't always feel like he's actually there. Spider-Man always looks like he's in CGI in this movie, except for the few instances where Peter has his mask off, and even then, he still looks rubbery, and it kinda takes me out. Why does Peter Parker need an Iron Man version of the Spider-Man suit? There is no reason whatsoever for that. If this were the kind of Spider-Man movie it should have been, then Tony Stark shouldn't know anything about this kid, let alone his secret identity. Also, I'm never convinced that Peter Parker has learned anything. After Peter rescues the Vulture and sends him to jail, Tony Stark changes his mind about Peter being an Avenger, and Peter turns him down. But I'm not convinced that he's actually changed his mind. There's no reason for what Adrian Toomes said about little guys to ring true for this kid. Because like I said, being a teenager isn't a good enough excuse for ignorance, and that's all Peter Parker is in this movie, ignorant. And then the movie ends on the most empty-ass cliffhanger in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and that's saying something. If the next Spider-Man movie deals with this in any meaningful way, I will be genuinely surprised. I'm more excited for the Marvel Spider-Man PS4 video game than I am for the sequel to this movie. Finally, Peter Parker's aunt, May Parker. Let's get something out of the way right now. No, I don't give a that she's younger. I will admit, I always thought that Marissa Tomei was a weird casting choice for Aunt May, especially since it seems to be a running gag that as Peter Parker gets younger, his aunt does too. And while Marissa Tomei is nowhere near as annoying as I thought she would be, there was really no good reason for Aunt May to be here. The only reason she's in the movie is to remind us that we're watching a Spider-Man movie, even when this character has nothing in common with Spider-Man. Is there anything that I did like about Spider-Man Homecoming? Well, putting the classic Spider-Man theme in front of the Marvel logo and putting Spider-Man in the logo is a nice touch. Unfortunately, it advertises a much better movie than this movie. Kinda like putting the gun barrel at the beginning of Spectre. I think, given the right script, Tom Holland is a good replacement for Garfield, and my issues with his character have more to do with the script and the direction, though it's hard to tell which one is to blame. There's a lot more that I could have brought up, like the bastardization of Flash Thompson, the way this movie vilifies Captain America, and Shocker being a half character in this movie. But I'll just end by saying that it's not a very bad movie, but it's not a very good Spider-Man movie by any stretch of the imagination. This movie is more concerned with the novelty of Spider-Man being in the Marvel Cinematic Universe than it is on telling a story, or giving us a character to root for. So I can only give Spider-Man Homecoming a 0.5 out of 4, and that 0.5 is for the opening music. Put simply, f*** this movie. So now you know how I feel about Spider-Man Homecoming.
And knowing is half the battle.